David Cronenberg is back, and that's something that's worth getting excited about. Maybe the most famous Canadian director of all time, David Cronenberg is the man responsible for some of the smartest and most twisted genre films of all time, things like The Fly, Videodrome, Crash and Naked Lunch, but he's also made plenty of brilliant non-genre films too, A History of Violence, Eastern Promises and Cosmopolis amongst others. He's proven himself as someone who can more or less do anything that he chooses to turn his hand to, and that pretty much anything that he touches turns to gold. But now, after an 8-year absence, David Cronenberg is back, and he's bringing his unique sensibilities and his insightful approach to filmmaking back to more explicitly sci-fi horror genre stuff with Crimes of the Future, which is the first Cronenberg film to come from an original screenplay by the director himself since 1999's Existenz. So, new David Cronenberg is a massively exciting prospect, just because in a time when so many of the great genre directors have either passed away, or given up the ghost and retired from filmmaking, or have just sold out their individuality in order to pursue bigger, less personal films, David Cronenberg remains someone who you can always rely on to do exactly what he wants to do, to be himself and to not sell out. In fact, there's an argument that he's the most consistent of the so-called masters of horror, in that he's made new films every few years since the mid-70s, without ever doing a big, easy money gig, or just falling back and doing something lazy just to give the fans what they want. He's never just gone, oh well, I'll just make Videodrome 2 to cash in on some 80s nostalgia. He's always been a totally ideas-driven director who appears to be living the filmmaking dream of basically choosing to make whatever project interest him creatively without fear of compromise or having to appeal to an audience of consumers. Bear that in mind for now, because that's going to be something that will be important later on. But of all the classic directors of decades gone by, David Cronenberg may just be the most consistently individual, never growing stale or complacent, and always trying out new things whilst always totally being himself. So welcome back, David Cronenberg, because 2022 needs you and guys like you more than ever now. So what do we get? Well, we get Crimes of the Future, a film that's extremely tenuously connected to this hour-long experimental sci-fi film that David Cronenberg made in 1970, in that it expands upon an idea from one scene of that film and builds an entirely unique world around it.
His body has begun to create puzzling organs, each one very complex, very perfect, unique, yet seemingly without function. As each is surgically removed, it is quickly replaced by another equally mysterious.
It's not by any means a remake of the 1970 film, but in the era of let's make a sequel to Halloween and call it Halloween, the reused title seems to be almost a coincidence. Although oddly, I think that it's actually quite a loose fit as a title for either film. I think that David Cronenberg must have just liked the way that it sounded and wasn't really that bothered about repeating himself in that way. So, what's the new Crimes of the Future about? Well, they're set in this kind of grim, colourless dystopian future where we learn that humanity is undergoing a period of evolutionary transition, adapting to life in an entirely new, artificial environment. Viggo Mortensen, who is one of Cronenberg's favourite actors, this being their fourth collaboration together, plays Saul Tenser, a man whose body is sprouting strange growths and growing new organs at random on an almost daily basis. However, rather than ending up as a laboratory freak, Saul Tenser has harnessed his body's unique properties and has become a performance artist. The performance in question is the surgical removal, before an enraptured audience, of his various growths and strange new mutant organs, carried out by his partner in crime Caprice, who is played by Léa Seydoux. This is made possible by the fact that humanity has adapted over the years to a state where people no longer feel pain, and so surgeries are carried out matter-of-factly without any anaesthetics. There's also the fact that people have become so dulled and desensitized to experience of any kind that it takes the cutting of their flesh to actually trigger any kind of a response. We see scenes where people cut one another whilst in a passionate embrace, which in this future is basically the equivalent of just giving someone a cheeky snog. It's a society in which masochism has become normalised, but at the cost of any kind of deeper emotional connections between the people of this world, and their senses being too dulled to respond to anything less than the actual cutting of their own flesh. So Sol Tensor and Caprice get wrapped up in an investigation whilst pursuing ever more extreme forms of artistic and erotic stimulation, as we see their acts becoming ever more extreme even as the light of passion begins to fade from their eyes, passion both for their art and for one another. Throw into the mix Kirsten Stewart as a quirky, fanishly infatuated bureaucrat who's lusting after an intimate surgical encounter with Sol Tensor, and a huge amount of soul-searching, musings on the nature of art and the way in which it affects an audience, and a lot of very detailed, carefully thought-out sci-fi world-building, and you've got Crimes of the Future.
Come on in.
So there's a number of interesting things about Crimes of the Future, but I think the most fascinating is that this is really the closest that David Cronenberg has come to making something that seems to have an almost autobiographical significance to his own career as a filmmaker. To that end, his main characters are artists, which seems unusual at first for the leads of a Cronenberg film, but they're artists that perform with surgical tools. Caprice herself is a former trauma surgeon, which seems a suitably Cronenbergian role, but the interesting thing isn't that David Cronenberg has decided to move away from making a film about rational scientific characters, but that he's making a film in which science and surgery have now become a means of artistic expression. It isn't his characters and by extension his worldview that have changed, it's everybody else around them that has changed, and this is very much the way that you can look at Cronenberg himself as being this constant force in a creatively turbulent world of increasingly ephemeral voices. So the character of Caprice is still a surgeon, but she uses the human body to make art. Now, when you say David Cronenberg's name to anyone, pretty much the first thing that comes to mind is the phrase body horror. Now that's interesting because David Cronenberg himself has all but disowned the phrase body horror, because he claims that he doesn't understand how exactly it relates to his work, and in actual fact, he describes what he focuses on as being less body horror and more body beautiful. Essentially that he's more interested in exploring the body as a piece of art and celebrating new forms that it can take, rather than in trying just to get a cheap shock reaction from gory body mutating special effects. Now obviously you can see that there's a very clear connection between the character of Caprice and Cronenberg himself. Both are fascinated by the exposing of the body for all to see, and in harnessing strange ways in which it can mutate and be reshaped in order to create art. But equally, more than just being about David Cronenberg, Crimes of the Future has got a greater significance in what it's got to say about Cronenberg's own take on the creative process itself. Now the interesting thing is that his previous film, which was 2014's Maps to the Stars, was his big Hollywood satire. It was this twisted, grotesque parody of the dark side of the movie-making business, but it wasn't a film that was drawn from Cronenberg's own experiences, and really was a film that had no great significance for Cronenberg on a personal level, whereas Crimes of the Future, despite its sci-fi trappings, is really Cronenberg's great filmmaking metaphor. I think that a lot of this becomes clear when you consider the casting of Viggo Mortensen, when you understand the amazing creative relationship that the two men have. They first partnered up in 2005 for A History of Violence, and went on to make Eastern Promises and A Dangerous Method since then. But more importantly, Cronenberg and Mortensen have formed a deep connection that extends to a very passionate and fruitful personal and creative friendship. It's clear if you ever watch them speak together that David Cronenberg is, if only at the very least on an artistic level, completely infatuated with Viggo Mortensen. Therefore, Mortensen's role in Crimes of the Future is essentially playing a grotesque version of Viggo Mortensen the actor. You really can't get a better metaphor for Cronenberg and Viggo Mortensen's working relationship. Mortensen passively offers up new parts of himself to his partner, freshly grown for each new performance, whilst his partner stages the whole routine, and calmly and clinically works out how to get the best results from their human canvas. The only way that it could be made any clearer would be if David Cronenberg himself had actually played the part of Caprice instead of Léa Seydoux. So, Caprice and Soltenser hooking up and engaging in this live-in sadomasochistic relationship is really the ultimate fantasy of a director who's found their own true artistic muse, like, I believe, David Cronenberg has with Viggo Mortensen.
That's the master-slave thing, it works really well.
But I think just generally on a bigger scale, there's so many indicators that the world of Crimes of the Future is one that's meant to draw parallels with today's media landscape. The increasingly drab and brown surroundings suggest the bland and boring nature of today's awful, colourless genre output, where bureaucracy stifles any genuine creativity and individuality is rigidly policed and dissuaded. There's a wonderful line early on that hints at today's obsession with intellectual diversionary tactics such as the politics of personal identity, when someone says that the Registry, which is this facelessly bureaucratic organisation that polices all artistic individuality, insists that in this new world, all art has to be uniquely self-referential, which, in an age of truly hideous social media-spawned narcissism, is an incredibly resonant idea. How many times we hear so-called creatives these days talking about representation and seeing yourself in films, when the reality is that the exact opposite should be true, that unless you can lose your own sense of identity and step outside yourself to become immersed in fantasy and imaginative storytelling, then there's no way that you can ever really expand and come to terms with much bigger issues and ideas. So where does all of it lead to then? Well, David Cronenberg has always been a man with a certain reputation for provocative material. Therefore, his on-screen artists seek the ultimate provocation. After carving up their own bodies, exploring the human and post-human forms as Cronenberg did in the peak of his 80s and 90s work, our characters find their audiences growing increasingly desensitized and jaded. The fact that the people in this world now no longer feel pain is ultimately indicative of the fact that they simply don't feel anything, that they can't be reached, and that their senses and therefore their emotions and their thoughts have become deadened. So Caprice herself feels threatened by this, when she realises that her work has inspired others to copy her, and that when they do, they ultimately get better results than she did, because the audience already feels like they've kind of seen Soltenser and Caprice before, that their act is old hat, even though they're the only ones in the whole film that are genuinely organically creative. Therefore, they pursue an ever more extreme showstopper to prove to their jaded audience that they still have the power to be provocative, which, even though I'm sure David Cronenberg is far too at peace with himself to ever feel personally threatened, must be a position that's got at least some resonance for a director whose work has been heavily scrutinised and picked apart by fans and scholars alike since the 1970s. But I think the more interesting side to this isn't that David Cronenberg feels threatened by imitators, but that the work of creatives that consistently pursue a pure creative instinct like Cronenberg and his surrogate Caprice do remain constant whilst the rest of the world moves around them. Caprice struggles with the adapt or die dilemma. Does she begin to copy other artists around her that are popular, or does she remain true to herself and her work? The fact that Crimes of the Future stayed in gestation for 8 years, or maybe even longer, suggests that Cronenberg was wrestling with the adapt or die issue himself, and thankfully with this film, he's shown us the best way to adapt, by staying completely true to your ideals no matter what, and to let the audience adapt to you. Because what great shock does Cronenberg save for the end of Crimes of the Future? Well, if you have seen the film, then you'll know what it is. And a lot of people have rushed to the obvious conclusions, again fixating on Crimes of the Future as a purely representative piece. It's a warning about climate change. Now, that lines up should you choose to see Crimes of the Future as a film that operates just on that surface level, in that it takes place in the reality of the characters, as opposed to being something that's much more metaphorical. If you follow through with the idea that Crimes of the Future, which David Cronenberg himself admits to not being a climate change polemic, and indeed David Cronenberg himself has been consistent in not making films that are just designed to lecture his audience, then the warning that this whole film throws up isn't just about bodily evolution and humanity changing on a physical level. In actual fact, the whole film is really about art, and artists and the creative process. Therefore, the finale of Crimes of the Future posits the scariest thing of all. Not big corporations fucking up the planet, but fucking up our art, policing what you can and can't say, subsuming genuine individuality, and in its place delivering something that's mass-produced, banal, and toothless. Because without wanting to spoil the film itself, the final image to take away from Crimes of the Future is that of ideas being birthed into the world with barcodes already on them, with future generations being born into a world where all creativity is approved by state and government, and any irregularities, anything strange and provocative, like the films of David Cronenberg, like an artist who is as individual and passionately political as Viggo Mortensen, no longer have any place. All art has to be uniquely self-referential. Just look at how so much entertainment these days comes not just from huge corporate monoliths, but how those corporations seek to create an identity for themselves which is greater and more important than the films themselves, which just become these hollow, interchangeable slices of tasteless, featureless product, and how small, independently produced, quirkier films and therefore ideas are being stifled and choked out of today's film industry. The future destruction of our world is a less scary prospect than the willing lobotomization of our art and creativity, because I've seen how many people have watched Crimes of the Future and just shrugged or dismissed it, or loudly declared that David Cronenberg has lost his touch. To all of those people, I can only say, you're missing the point. The world needs minds like David Cronenberg, true visionaries that are unafraid to show us the dark side, and to confront us with gruesome existential nightmares about our own worst fears. Because with every new film that David Cronenberg makes, the further away he gets from the days of bodies dissolving and disintegrating, and the more cerebral and philosophical he becomes. Although, of course, even his gooeyest, bloodiest films rarely indulged shock for its own sake. I'd go so far as to say that Crimes of the Future is actually one of Cronenberg's most cerebral and in a lot of ways passionate films, because the ideas that it throws up, conglomerization of art, the fusing of artist and muse in the passionate pursuit of meaningful creativity, and of literally bleeding for your work before an audience that's so willfully jaded and afraid to connect emotionally to anything but themselves, these are all things that are very close to David Cronenberg's heart as a filmmaker, in how closely they mirror the essential aspects of his work, and the ways in which audiences relate to that work. Because Crimes of the Future is a wake-up call, not just heralding the return of David Cronenberg, but hopefully it's a film that will mark the beginning of a new Cronenberg era, one that's even darker, one that's more personal and idiosyncratic and more soul-searchingly resonant than ever before. It's a film that cries out for the return of fearless, uncensored filmmaking, and a move away from the cowardly punch-pulling that's infected so much of current-year genre filmmaking. We need David Cronenberg now more than ever, because Crimes of the Future is such a resonant fable for our times. David Cronenberg isn't a shock jock just trying to repulse you, he's a filmmaker with the skill of a trained surgeon who knows exactly what to do to open up your mind and to make you really think about things like nobody else can. And his work will always remain some of the most potent in the entire genre. Go and watch every film that David Cronenberg has ever made, because you'll be a better person for doing so. You'll see things that nobody else will ever show you. Let his ideas wash over you and get into your head. Be shocked and be repulsed and be intoxicated. Open your mind to strange, twisted ideas. Embrace stuff that feels uncomfortable and alien and disturbing. But just don't ever be bored, because that is the greatest sin of all. Help us, David Cronenberg. You're our only hope.